There's a hidden math formula that changes everything about retirement risk. And once I show it to you, you can stop worrying about your portfolio. And most people have never seen this. Now, imagine your life's saving going down by 50% overnight, right? You've been consciously planning for retirement. You're right at the doorstep and bam, your $1 million turns into 500,000 or your 5 million turns into 2.5 million. Now, I'm guessing that you've already played that scenario out in your mind and you're not alone. But here's what nobody tells you. There's a specific calculation that shows you exactly what it would take for that type of 50% correction to your savings to happen. And when you see the numbers, everything in your retirement changes. Now, the traditional financial services industry would have you believe that the only solution to this problem is a better retirement portfolio. And not just a better portfolio, but also one that only they can build and that only they can understand. But here's what I want to show you today. There's a completely different way to think about retirement risk, one that's based on your unique situation and not generic market fears. And once you see the hidden math, the fear will start to dissolve. Now, the industry profits from keeping you scared, and the media profits from fear-based headlines. So both of them are using that fear to manipulate retiree behaviors. But let me take you on a journey that shows you what is actually likely to happen rather than the fear porn that we're being sold. So understanding whether you should actually be afraid of a 50% portfolio loss comes down to three questions. First, what's the likelihood of a 50% market correction? Second, how quickly does that type of correction occur? And then third, and this is the one that really changes the game, based on how your portfolio is actually constructed, how much would your portfolio actually participate in that type of correction? So let's start with the first question. When you see what I'm about to show you, you might not actually believe this. I didn't believe this when I first saw it, but the data is the data. Right? So this research here on the screen is from Ben Carlson, who's a CFA, and this research goes back through 150 years of stock market data to 1871. And what Ben found is that corrections of 40% or larger have only happened roughly 5% of years. But here's the thing, there have actually only been 3 declines of 50% or more in magnitude. Now, the most severe of those was the Great Depression in the 1930s, where stock values fell nearly 90%. But the other 2 declines of 50% or more actually didn't even exceed 60%. They were both in the 50% range. So using simple math, over the past 153 years, there have been only 3 occurrences where markets declined by 50% or more. That's a frequency of less than 2% of all years of stock market history. I'm just showing you the historical frequency, and the frequency changes things because most of us spend all of our mental energy thinking about the magnitude of a potential crash, right? That 50%. But we rarely think about the likelihood, the probability. And so when I first saw this data, I got frustrated, right? I got angry that the industry keeps people terrified of something that has happened 3 times in 153 years, while never showing them the historical context. So now let's look at the second question. How quickly do these events happen? So this data here is also from Ben Carlson's research. And what you're seeing here is that market corrections, even the severe ones, rarely happen overnight. This here is a chart showing market corrections from 1946 to 2020. It shows the total percent of peak to trough decline, as well as how long it took to go from peak to trough, and then how long it took to go from trough back to break even. And what you see here is that market corrections, even the very severe ones, rarely happen overnight. They often take many, many months, sometimes years, to reach their bottom. You can see that these different market outcomes here range in duration from 3 months to as many as 31 months, going from peak to trough. Now, the 2000 to 2002 dot-com crash, that one took 31 months to go from top to bottom. The 2007 to 2009 great financial crisis took 17 months from top to bottom. Now, the point is, these aren't overnight events where you wake up and half your money is suddenly gone. These events unfold over time, giving you the ability to see what's happening and to respond. Now, here's the third question, and this is the one that most people have never thought about. Based on your portfolio construction, how much of the overall market correction would your portfolio, and therefore you, actually participate in? See, not all portfolios move in lockstep with the market. Let me give you an example. If the S&P 500 goes down 20%, does your portfolio go down 20%? Well, usually not. And that's why asset allocations exist. The goal of the asset allocation is to keep you from participating in all of the market's performance. So let's say a balanced portfolio, maybe 60% stock and 40% bonds, might only go down 12 or even 15%, when the market drops 20%. Conversely, that same portfolio, if the market goes up 20%, might only gain 12 or 15%. So, you participate less on the downside, you give up some upside. And so this is what we call your portfolio's participation rate. You're participating in a percentage of the market's movements, both up and down. By the way, this is actually very different from asset allocation because with asset allocation, you can have a 60% stock allocation and still participate in 100% of the market's movements, depending on what's actually inside or what stocks you're holding within that allocation. So participation rate is actually a far more accurate measure where asset allocation can, in my opinion, be extremely misleading. Now, all of what I've just talked about is what proper portfolio construction is all about. Tools like beta, variance, and market correlation can help us measure these things, but the goal is pretty simple. We want to build a portfolio that participates in the market's performance to the degree that matches your unique circumstances and your risk tolerance. So maybe you want a portfolio that participates in 60% of market's movements, maybe 70, maybe 50. It's going to depend on your specific situation. Now, to summarize real quickly before I show you the hidden math that I mentioned earlier, huge catastrophic events of 50% or more happen less than 2% of the time. They rarely happen as quick as we fear, and your portfolio doesn't participate in 100% of market movements anyways. You might only participate in a fraction, depending on how the portfolio is constructed. And so here's where we can combine those things and things get really interesting. The hidden math formula that changes everything is a calculation that most people will never see because it makes complex portfolio management look actually surprisingly simple. I had a client come to me a few months ago, let's call her Sarah, who was terrified of retiring. She had $1.8 million saved, but thought that she needed far more than that to be safe because she was worried, what if the market crashes and I have to dramatically change my lifestyle? A totally valid concern. So I showed her this calculation that I'm going to show you next. And she literally looked at me and said, that's all it would take. So let me show you what I showed her. So the first thing we had to do for Sarah was set her up some portfolio guardrails. Now, portfolio guardrails are basically tripwires that tell you when you would need to adjust your spending. Think of them like alert systems that say, hey, now's time to make a small adjustment to your spending. And so for Sarah's situation, which you can see here on the screen, with $1.8 million in retirement, wanting to spend about $130,000 per year, and no other major income sources, we end up with guardrails that have these parameters. So we told the guardrail software, we want an 80% likelihood that Sarah will underspend her money and a 20% likelihood that she will need to make a spending adjustment during retirement. Now, based on those parameters, her lower guardrail would trigger if her portfolio declined by 29%, which is what you see here on the screen, meaning her portfolio goes from 1.8 to $1.29 million. If that were to happen, she would have a spending adjustment that would need to be made of 5%. So she would reduce her spending from $130K a year to $122K per year, roughly $500 per month. Now, that's not catastrophic, right? It's a pretty small adjustment. So here's the question Sarah asked. Okay, but what would the market need to do for my portfolio to decline by the 29% you're telling me here? And so this is where the hidden math comes in. So we designed Sarah's portfolio to participate in about 60% of the market. So if the market goes up 20%, our goal would be that she gains 12%. And if the market goes down 20%, our goal would be that she loses 12%. So for Sarah's portfolio decline by 29%, we would do the following calculation. We would divide 29%, which is her lower guardrail, into her market participation, which is 60% in this case. And that would tell us the size of this total stock market event that would be required to cause her portfolio to go down by the 29% that would trigger her lower guardrail. So in her case, it would look like 29% divided by 60%. The result would be what you see here. So this yellow box shows the result of 29 divided into 60%. And that ends up being 48.33%. So what this says is that the S&P 500 would need to crash by 48.33% for Sarah's portfolio to decline enough to trigger or hit the bottom of this tripwire here and require a 5% spending adjustment in her retirement. Now, remember what we learned earlier? Corrections over 50% have happened 3 times in history or in the last 150 years. So we're talking about needing a nearly 50% decline before Sarah gets a lower guardrail triggered. Now, those events take months to unfold and would give Sarah time to see it coming and prepare. And so Sarah then asked me the next logical question, which everyone asks, which is, okay, well, it's going to take a 50% market correction for me to trigger lower guardrail. I feel a lot better about that. What would it take for me to actually lose 50% of my money? And we can run this formula here and just change this number here to 50%. And you would see that it would require an 83% market correction for her to lose 50% of her portfolio value. Now, that's happened once in history, once in 153 years, which was during the Great Depression. And so this is why I say your portfolio value matters less than you think. What matters is understanding the math of what it would actually take to require you to make a spending adjustment in retirement. Now, once Sarah saw this math, her retirement outlook changed. She told me she stopped worrying about the market and started living her retirement. She retired 6 months later on her $1.8 million. And this is what this type of hidden calculation does, right? It takes abstract market fears and turns them into concrete, personalized reality. You're no longer asking, what if the market crashes? You're asking, what would the market have to do to force me to make a change? And then when you run those numbers, for most people, the answer is you probably don't have to make a change. It would require something so large and so unlikely that it pretty much never happens. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean market corrections can't or won't happen. And it doesn't mean you won't feel uncomfortable and make a spending adjustment even before a lower guardrail is triggered. Those things can absolutely happen. But understanding this math and these probabilities, understanding what it would actually take to impact your specific situation is what can transform fear into informed confidence. And so if you don't want to spend your retirement paralyzed by market fear, right? If you don't want to leave hundreds of thousands of dollars of life on the table because you were too scared to pull the trigger and spend your well-earned savings, I encourage you to watch a free class that I've recorded called the 4-Step System to Building the Retirement of Your Dreams. In it, I will walk you through the complete framework for confident retirement spending, including how to use guardrails, how to calculate your participation rate, and how to generally build a retirement plan that matches your actual risk tolerance. Just click the link in the description below this video or scan the QR code that is flashing on the screen now to watch for free. Thank you as always for your time and attention. I will see you in the next video.